Hello and welcome to our next module here in the class. What we're going to be doing in this module is continuing our discussion of specific topics within the area of sexual ethics. And so we're going to move on in this module to looking at the controversy surrounding homosexuality in Catholic teaching and in terms of the ongoing moral debate about homosexuality in our culture today. And of course, as we did previously with contraception, we're going to be drawing on kind of a basic understanding of Catholic sexual ethics as rooted in natural law. So that's really going to be our focus here today. So we're going to start similar to the way we did last time, kind of spelling out, look, what are the basic natural law arguments against the morality of homosexual acts. And then I want to turn and look at some of the more controversial topics or debatable topics, specifically looking at the question of homosexual acts versus homosexuality or same-sex attraction, the orientation versus the acts, and how do we distinguish those in our Catholic and ethical discourse. And then also looking at this question of whether or not there is a predisposition in certain people towards same-sex attraction or homosexuality, and how that might impact our moral judgments. And then also then move on to look at some of the more kind of policy or cultural issues surrounding this today in regards to whether or not there ought to be some sort of politically sanctioned or affirmed unions or marriages for homosexual couples. And then also I want to touch on the issue of homophobia or revulsion towards homosexuality, and whether or not such a thing is acceptable or something that ought to be tolerated or even encouraged in people from a Catholic or a natural law perspective. And so those are some of the issues I want to run through here in our discussion today. So to start then, our first order of business is to just spell out the basic natural law argument in regard to homosexual acts. And as I'm sure you probably know, or if you didn't know already, would be able to guess pretty quickly, the traditional natural law position is that homosexual acts are immoral. And they're typically seen as immoral for several different reasons, really. On a most basic level, if we're going to look at sexual acts as being, by their nature, in the natural law sense, procreative and unitive, obviously in the case of homosexual acts, they're not going to be procreative, right? That there is no potential for offspring or for conception from homosexual acts. And so that right there would be, from a traditional natural law perspective, a sufficient argument against their morality, is that if we look at the nature of human sexuality, it is designed for these two ends, and that we ought to always use it in a way that is at least open to those ends. And homosexual acts are not open to procreation, therefore it is contrary to the design of the human person, of the human body, and so it is not going to be moral from a traditional natural law perspective. So that would be kind of the most basic argument. Now beyond that, there are other arguments similar to what we discussed last time in terms of contraception. So it is not simply just about the brute nature of the biology or the organs involved, that there is more to human sexuality than that, right? And that if we look at the relationships, there are issues here as well, right? That the procreative element to heterosexual relations entails relationships, or at least the openness to relationships, right? So that when a person enters into sexual intimacy, included in that, in the natural law model, is the possibility that this might result in a child, right? And that is going to change the entire character of that relation. That it has this openness to deep and important self-sacrificial relationships, right? That if I enter into this kind of intimacy with a person, knowing that it might bring with it parenthood and a long-term connection with my partner as parents, that adds a depth, a dimension in time, if you will, to sexual intimacy that isn't there if there is no procreative element to the marital act or to a sexual encounter. So that would certainly be a relational aspect of it, right? And in addition to that, one of the things that is typically brought up in sort of the natural law arguments is that when we look at the unitive aspect as well, that there is something different when it comes to homosexual acts versus heterosexual acts. And this is a really, as you might know or guess, a really vexed issue, and certainly something that many people strongly object to. And you will see that in one of the readings that I give you to consider for this module. But the traditional natural law position is that when we talk about the unitive aspect of sex, that it includes a certain complementarity of the two sexes, right? So that men and women are designed to be in this kind of relationship with a member of the opposite sex. And so that there is something about this close, intimate, self-sacrificial relationship between a man and a woman that is unique, right? And that sexual difference, that sexual complementarity adds a dimension to that relationship that isn't possible for a relationship between two men or between two women, right? And of course, in terms of historical culture, right, this has always been seen to be the case by the vast majority of people, of sources, of what have you, right? This idea of men and women as being different in important, meaningful ways, and as men and women being in this kind of relationship, that has a unique characteristic to the relationship, right? And that entering into this relationship with someone who is other than yourself in this fundamental way makes it a special kind of relationship, one that forces us to change, one that brings something to the relationship that we lack. And again, if you read much in terms of the theology of the body, whether in John Paul II's own writings or in many of the writings that have followed, this is something that receives a great deal of attention, right? That going back to Genesis, when God makes man and woman, and it's man and woman together that are in the image and likeness of God, and that it's the two aspects of humanity in relationship to one another that fully image God in the sense that Genesis is trying to get at there. Now, again, you don't need me to tell you that this is an idea or an argument that is hotly contested today, right? So the sort of leading edge of our culture, if you will, or the academic world, certainly for the most part, has attacked very strongly this idea of gender distinction or gender complementarity, that somehow men and women are in an important way different. So that idea is rejected, right, by those who would argue that gender is essentially a social construct or is something that is amenable to our will. And they would argue that the differences are not really fundamental to a person's identity, that men or women can be essentially the same, or they may have none of the typical characteristics associated with their gender or what have you. And not surprisingly then, many in our culture, and certainly in the academy today, would reject the idea of there being some sort of unique complementarity between men and women. And they would argue that you can have true complementarity in a relationship between two men or between two women, and that can produce the same development of the person, produce the same sort of character, qualities, and virtues that one would find from a relationship between spouses of opposite sex. And so there is obviously disagreement on that topic today, but from a traditional perspective, the argument would be that there is something missing from the unitive nature of sex if you don't have that complementarity to it. Now again, you'll see in one of the articles I give you an argument that these relationships are just as meaningful, just as character developing in their nature as heterosexual relationships. And again, we can talk about that more in the discussion. I would simply say I think that the research on that issue, it is far too soon to declare that a closed case. And if we look over the vast majority of human history and cultures, it has not been understood that way. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that further research might not be helpful in helping us understand the situation, but the claim that there is nothing to gender complementarity seems premature at best. Okay, so again, getting back to our rundown of the traditional arguments against homosexual acts, we look at the nature of sexual acts as being procreative. That is certainly problematic when it comes to homosexual acts. We can look at the unitive nature of sex, and traditionally that would be seen as lacking in a homosexual relationship. And then again, we can look at the broader impact on society and that what promotes human flourishing in communities and in a culture. And again, this kind of draws on the preceding ideas, right? That the argument here would be along the lines of human cultures do best when people are encouraged and when people's sexual drives are channeled into enduring long-term family relationships, and that is uniquely possible in heterosexual marriage, right? So that human sexuality is very important, very powerful force, and when it is unmoored from family and children and generations, that it can become a destructive force. And that we need to do everything we can in the society to encourage people to pursue that sort of sexual relationship which is in the context of marriage, and that is what will allow people to truly flourish as individuals, and which will also support the stability of society as a whole. And so again, this would be kind of the broad scale argument, similar to, in many ways, the argument you find in Humanae Vitae against contraception in terms of its cultural impact. The acceptance or support of homosexual activity on a cultural level would have a similar effect in terms of separating sexual activity from these broader relationships, broader set of responsibilities that go along with procreative, unitive sex between men and women. So that is really kind of the standard argument against homosexual acts from a natural law perspective. So now that we've talked a little bit about natural law judgments of homosexual acts, we need to transition towards a discussion of the distinction between homosexuality or an orientation towards homosexual acts or same-sex attraction and the acts themselves, right? So we need to talk about that. But as a kind of way of making that connection or bridging that, I also do want to just pause for a moment to discuss a little bit the biblical evidence and how it is brought into this discussion and debate. And in some ways this goes a little outside of a strictly natural law argument, although in terms of Catholic ethical teaching, Scripture certainly is still an important part of how the Church develops and formulates its teaching. And also, it's important as an indication, certainly, of human history and human judgments about these things. And it's brought up in the chapter I would have you read from an outside perspective or a dissenting perspective. They address the biblical arguments and dismiss them as not really providing clear evidence against the acceptance of homosexual acts. So I wanted to just touch on that briefly here. One of the key passages brought up in the reading I will give you is Romans chapter 1, right? And that is the most significant New Testament passage addressing homosexuality. And therefore, I think it is probably the most important, because I think as the authors of that reading point out, we do need to make careful distinctions about how we apply Old Testament law towards modern life today, right? And that there are certainly things like kosher laws, like certain even sexual prohibitions that we no longer consider applicable to the Christian era or to the modern world. And so it would be less significant evidence if the only biblical passages addressing homosexuality were from the Old Testament. But we do have in Romans this significant, or at least fairly significant, discussion of homosexuality in the context of Paul's discussion of human sinfulness in the world in Romans chapter 1. Now, I think it's important to agree with the authors to a certain extent and say that Romans chapter 1 is not evidence that homosexuality is somehow the worst of sins. And we certainly encounter this, sadly enough, I would say, here in Kansas with some of the people from the Westboro church who often cite Romans chapter 1 as evidence that homosexuality is the worst sin and therefore God hates America for its toleration of homosexuality and all of the really reprehensible things those people say. That is not, I think, a fair or valid reading of the text. And as the authors of the reading I give you point out, the text is primarily focused on the sin of idolatry, right? And it is a rejection of God's authority that is really the fundamental and worst sin in Romans chapter 1. Homosexuality is, however, treated as clearly a bad thing. It is seen as, in some ways, a punishment for this more basic rejection of God. But really, Paul focuses on it as an example of what sin is, right? And I would say that this is really a passage that affirms the truth of natural law from Scripture itself, right? That what we see in Romans chapter 1 is a vision of morality where the right thing to do is act in accord with the nature God gave us, and to act contrary to that nature is to be immoral, right? And Paul, I think, focuses on homosexuality because he sees it as the clearest indication of what sin is, right? That acting in this way, contrary to the nature God has given us, is for him kind of the epitome of sin, which is not to say that it is the worst sin. It's just the clearest practical example that he can offer of what sin is in his understanding. So I would say, to a certain extent, it's important to acknowledge that there is some validity to that rejection of Romans 1 as addressing homosexuality, at least from those who would claim that it is situating homosexuality as the worst possible sin. That's just not the case. Now, that being said, one of the key points that the authors make in their article or in their chapter is to argue that Scripture has no understanding of homosexuality as an orientation or as a significant part of a person's personality or makeup, and that it is only homosexual acts that are condemned by Scripture. And so their argument is essentially that, well, if heterosexuals commit certain homosexual acts, that might be wrong, but if it's a homosexual, then it is in keeping with their nature and therefore moral. And so I guess my initial response to that line of argumentation would simply be to say, well, they may not have spelled it out in kind of the clear psychological terminology we have today, but I think it's extremely unlikely that people in the biblical time did not have an understanding that there are certain people who have an enduring significant attraction to members of the same sex, right? If it is a part of a significant number of people's just constitutional makeup, as the authors of that chapter would lead us to believe, then I think it's highly unlikely that people in the biblical period were unaware of that fact, were unaware of the fact that there were numbers of people in their communities who experienced on an ongoing basis that same-sex attraction. And so for them to argue that, well, the biblical authors simply weren't sophisticated enough, given their historical and cultural context, to recognize this as a feature of certain people's makeup, I think is just not convincing, right? I think it is much more likely that they understood that there were many people who had an enduring attraction to members of the same sex, and yet they still argue that the natural state that God created people to exist in is one of heterosexual relationships, or perhaps celibacy is another alternative to that. So the presentation of a heterosexual norm in the biblical canon is not because they weren't aware of the possibility of something else. I think it's almost certain that they were aware of other possibilities, and yet they still assert this heterosexual norm because that's what they understood God's design for people to be. And so that's really going to bring us now to talk a little more specifically about homosexual acts versus homosexuality or homosexual orientation. Now, whether or not there would have been such a thing as homosexuality or homosexual orientation understood in the biblical period, obviously that is a widely understood phenomenon or category in the modern world, right? And one of the main arguments by those who would challenge the traditional teaching on homosexuality is precisely what we were just talking about, right? The idea that there was not in earlier periods a recognition of homosexuality as a persistent characteristic of a person's makeup, right? That there are people who don't just experience this as a transitory attraction, right? That it is rather something that endures, and many would argue has a basis in a person's physiology, genetics or brain structure or chemical makeup of the brain, or wherever it might be located, or some combination of those things. That is a widely recognized part of the discussion today. So here's really, I guess, one of the critical points to address in this debate, because if you look at the chapter by Salzman and Lawler, where they're arguing with the traditional teaching, this is one of their primary points, is that if we're going to make an argument from natural law that people ought to act in accord with their nature, then they would argue that it follows if certain people have a natural inclination towards the same sex, then in fact it is natural for them to act in accord with that, right? And that would then render homosexual acts moral, given that line of reasoning. So that is one of the primary arguments put forward today, if not the primary argument. So how would we respond to that? Well, one of the things to consider is looking at the evidence that's been put together for this argument, right? And here I would simply say, personally, I don't necessarily have the medical or psychological expertise to make a conclusive judgment on that point. I think what I would offer as a hopefully educated layperson's take on it is that there isn't an absolute clear consensus in the literature, right? There are real questions about causality. There have been differences in brain structure, differences in chemical makeup of neurotransmitters and things between those who identify as homosexual and those who do not. So there do seem to be some differences. Now, there are questions raised about causality, because it is in fact possible by behavior to modify brain structure and to modify brain chemistry. So some would dispute those claims and argue that it is in fact the homosexual lifestyle or homosexual behavior that shapes the brain structure or the chemical composition or whatever it might be. And there might be some valid questions to raise about those studies and that sort of line of argumentation. That being said, given the preponderance of the studies, and even in documents from bishops and magisterial offices and things, there is an acknowledgement that there may well be a biological basis for homosexual orientation or attraction in certain people. And so it does seem at least plausible, and I would say probably likely, that there are people who, because of whatever it might be, brain structure, chemicals, psychological conditioning and upbringing, or whatever it might be, there are people who find this to be a persistent feature of their lives, that they find themselves attracted to members of the same sex. So then, if we grant that, right, while excluding maybe the details of it, we're going to grant that this is the case for some people. What conclusions can we draw from that? Well, the conclusions that Salzman and Lawler draw are that this then makes that natural for these people, and therefore they ought to do it, right? And here's where I think, from a natural law perspective and a theological perspective, we would need to raise some serious questions, right? Because simply given the fact that a person has a predisposition towards a certain behavior based on their brain structure, their social upbringing, their neurotransmitter makeup, whatever it might be, that does not in and of itself make something natural in the natural law sense, right? Because when we talk about what is natural in a natural law sense, we are talking about what is it that leads a person to flourish? What are the characteristics of an ideal life of a human person? Right? This is not simply what inclinations, what tendencies does each individual find within themselves, right? Because there is, in the understanding of traditional natural law, there are certain standards, right? And simply because I may differ from those standards doesn't make my differentiation my norm. It doesn't make it natural for me to differ from those standards, right? And look, this is in many ways, we recognize this to be the case in many other aspects of our lives, right? If a car were to be produced where the steering wheel turned it the other way, right? We wouldn't say, well, you know, that's natural for that car. We would say, no, look, cars are meant to work in a certain way. Therefore, this is a differentiation or deviation from the standard for cars. Or when we look at, you know, different species in the natural world, right? We can say there's a certain norm for this species, right? And we could say certain individuals in that species meet certain parts of that norm, but probably don't meet others. And really, in terms of natural law, you know, not to belittle people by comparing them to cars or animals, right? This is the case for everyone, I would argue, in natural law, right? That there is no one who by their nature fits the ideals in every category, right? There are always going to be, I would think, and the testimony of the saints would seem to indicate, there are always going to be places where individuals struggle, where people have a tendency to not meet the ideal or the standard for true human flourishing and living. Right now, this might be a particularly challenging form of it, right? I would not claim that this is just another difficulty, like anger management or a tendency towards alcohol addiction or whatever it might be. I think those are other examples of cases where people may have a physiological predisposition, say, to not be able to control their anger easily, right? We wouldn't say that as a result that makes outbursts of anger natural for that person. There are people, it seems, who, many psychologists would argue that there are people who suffer from sex addiction, right? That they actually have aspects of their brain makeup that lead them to compulsive behavior as heterosexual people, right? That they tend to be unfaithful to spouses, or they tend to have a long string of promiscuous relationships. They may have a tendency in their brains towards that behavior. That doesn't make it natural for them, right? And so simply because certain people have a predisposition does not make it natural in the sense that natural law has traditionally understood that term. Now, of course, the response that one would receive from those advocating for acceptance of homosexuality would be that, well, in those other cases, that behavior leads to harming others. It leads to self-destruction or other negative outcomes, right? Whereas they would argue in the case of homosexuality that really only the negatives come from the social stigmatization, right? And that the relationships are otherwise conducive to human flourishing as any other relationship would be. And there, right, it's very difficult to solve that argument or to reach a conclusion on that. The articles or the chapter I've given you from Salzman and Lawler makes that claim, and they would say studies support this. But there are many other studies that would argue differently and would say that homosexual orientation and homosexual acts typically lead to things we consider not flourishing, right? That more promiscuity, much more problematic relationships, any number of other problems. And I think it's probably safe to say it would be very difficult to find objective, convincing data on this because it is such a divisive issue. But at the very least, I would argue that the fact that people have a natural inclination towards a behavior doesn't make it natural in natural law terms. So where do we go from there, right? If we do conclude that there can be this deep-seated tendency or orientation, but we argue that this is ultimately not conducive to human flourishing and homosexual acts are not moral according to natural law or scripture, well, where do we go from there, right? And here we can, I'll give you a document put out by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Cardinal Ratzinger at that time, which spells out the Church's position on this. It's the most recent kind of magisterial document addressing it. And basically the Church's position there is to say, look, there are people that seem to have a persistent attraction to the same sex. Having that attraction is not in and of itself sinful, right? It is not a sin to be attracted to members of the same sex. Now the document would say, and this of course stirred a great deal of furor when it was put out, that it is a disordered attraction, right? And by that, it simply means that if we take the traditional natural law standard, this is not a desire that is in keeping with that standard or that natural vision of the human person. And so if you were to follow this inclination, it would lead you away from that. That being said, again, it's not sinful to simply have the attraction. Acting on it, homosexual acts are still considered sinful. But of course, it's also important to note, right, that a great deal of pastoral care and understanding and compassion is called for by the magisterium as well, right? I would think that in any case where people persistently struggle with an inclination that is contrary to natural law, we ought to be understanding and accommodating of that, right? And I think, given, as we've talked about before, how fundamental to the human person sexuality is, for someone to find themselves in a position where they are persistently and consistently attracted to someone of the same sex, to not follow through on that inclination is going to require a very significant effort on their part, a significant sacrifice in terms of developing those virtues of temperance and chastity. And I think it's very important to recognize that and to recognize what is being called for when people with homosexual attraction are asked to follow the Church's teaching, to recognize that this is something that is a very significant sacrifice on their part that is being asked for. And I think too often the Church responds to people in a very negative way. I perhaps shouldn't say the Church, but people within the Church, whether it's lay people or even in some cases clergy, who respond to those who have homosexual attraction or orientation without that level of pastoral concern that I think the magisterium would say we ought to have. I think in part that is due to the very kind of aggressive nature of the homosexual movement, which we can talk about in a little bit, but I think it's not fair to lump all people who find themselves in this situation in with, say, the most combative members of the homosexual movement. I think we ought to default to a very pastoral approach to those who struggle with this, an acknowledgement that we all struggle in various areas, and we are all called to continually strive to better emulate the nature God wants us to have, and that we ought, the ultimate end that we ought to be striving for. So that's in sum the church's response to this distinction of homosexuality, homosexual orientation, and homosexual acts, and with a real emphasis on having a very pastoral approach towards those who find themselves in that situation. We have a fairly clear roadmap, I think, of some of the basics here, right? On the one hand, according to natural law reasoning, right, homosexual acts are contrary to human nature and are immoral in that they don't promote the true flourishing of people. There's also a recognition that some people find themselves consistently attracted to members of the same sex and have this homosexual orientation, which is not sinful in and of itself, but which is going to require a great deal of struggle and development of virtue and ought to be met with pastoral concern. And I think that's really kind of gives us the church's basic response to this issue. Now there are some complications beyond that, right? And one of the key ones is how do we think about this in political terms or cultural and social terms, right? And in some ways the legal question has been resolved at least to some degree already, right? That the Supreme Court has declared that homosexual marriage is valid and legal across the nation, right? So it's a legal fact that still leaves open, of course, the question of should that be the legal norm, and how ought we to respond to that legal reality, right? And there are going to undoubtedly be many legal battles in the years to come about the implications of homosexual marriage being validated by the Supreme Court. In this course, we're not really going to get into all of those details. I do want to address, though, right, one of the consistent arguments that is brought up in this debate in terms of the question of why will the church not support homosexual marriage or unions of some sort, right? And is that really motivated by homophobia or hatred of homosexuals? And without doubt, as mentioned before, there is certainly non-pastoral attitude that can be found in many people within the church. But I think at the same time we can make a good argument for why the church and why those within the church or those just seeking to follow natural law ought not to support homosexual marriages or unions, right? And it's, again, comes back to this idea of what are the implications for society when we disconnect sexuality from the family, from procreation, right? And that when we encourage and legalize other ways of living one's sexual life, that makes it that much more difficult to properly channel sexuality in a way that really leads to the flourishing of those involved in relationships, the flourishing of children, and the broader well-being of the community. And again, this is a debate we've kind of already touched on in terms of contraception, right? This is just another way of legalizing and making culturally acceptable a separation of sexuality from procreation in the family. And so to that extent, the church would say that we ought not to validate or affirm those sorts of relationships. Now, one of the arguments that might be brought forward is, given the realities, given the fact that there are many people who find themselves with this orientation, with this attraction, and given the reality that many of them are going to act on that, right? They aren't going to remain celibate for their adult lives. Doesn't it make sense then to encourage unions that will provide more of the goods of human sexuality and that will minimize some of the negative effects, right? So I think we could reasonably argue, right, that promiscuity, that having multiple sexual partners is, generally speaking, a negative thing, that it would exacerbate the tendency to say, treat people as a means to an end. Given that is just one particular factor to consider, wouldn't it make sense to encourage longer-term faithful relationships, right? And couldn't we then use that as a way for arguing for, well, even if it's not the natural law ideal, isn't it better to affirm long-term unions as a way of mitigating some of those problems, and also of, at least in some way, more approximating the sort of complete and total self-sacrificial love that is the norm or the ideal for traditional marriage. And again, this is something that is debated. Obviously, there are those who would argue that the church ought to be open to this sort of arrangement, and obviously in the political realm, that argument has prevailed. I think the traditional natural law response is something we've already mentioned, right, which would be to say that we can't affirm that because essentially we would be declaring something to be moral that is in fact not, right, and that it is not conducive to people's flourishing to separate sexuality from procreative and truly unitive relationship. And so, while yes, there may be better or worse relationships outside of that norm, we can't, in order to get that benefit, do something that is wrong, and that is to say that certain relationships are moral when in fact they are not. This would be a case of double effect, right? And it is immoral to say that something that is wrong is in fact right and acceptable. So whether the benefits or costs would be proportionate or not is in many ways a moot point. That we simply can't state it to be moral if it is not to get some perceived benefit in terms of more stable relationships or less damage done or better relationships between homosexual couples. Now that last point is something that I would ask you maybe to consider in your Blackboard comments, because as I said, that is something that there is debate on. I know it is something that many people struggle with on a more personal basis, right? That many of us have friends or family who are homosexuals and who would earnestly seek kind of confirmation or approval of that lifestyle by the church and by the government, and would argue that we ought to in fact do that. And many of us find ourselves in positions where we want to support stable relationships, we want to support people as much as we can, but there is this ultimate conflict with whether or not we can call moral and good that which natural law would say is not, right? So, as I've already explained, I think the church's position is clear. I think the natural law position, from my understanding, is clear, but you may well have comments or questions or different perspectives to take, so that would be something to consider on Blackboard. I would also be curious, one of the things I think that often gets brought up in this debate is this idea of homophobia, or this idea of bigotry, which raises, I think, a question of what ought the attitude towards those with homosexual orientation or inclination, what should that be, right? And one of the challenges is, how do we, as those who would seek to follow the church's teaching, how should we respond to those within the homosexual camp? And then finally, simply after you read the statement from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, now I also have you read that chapter from Salzman and Lawler, I would just ask you for your assessment of the arguments, right? Do you think that opposing view from Salzman and Lawler is persuasive, or does it have key points that you think are worth engaging with or worth questioning the traditional natural law response, or do you find the traditional natural law approach to this issue convincing and find Salzman and Lawler's arguments deficient in various areas? So I'll ask you for your take on all of that and some of those specific questions, and then of course I certainly would encourage any comments or questions or things that you would like to bring up for discussion as well. And so I look forward to having that discussion with you on Blackboard, and I will hope to hear from you there.